Hello. So my topic today is extremism. You might be wondering why extremism should be discussed by philosophers at all. It sounds more like a topic for political scientists and political theorists. Well, certainly, if you look at the history of philosophy, there's been a lot of interest historically in the topic of fanaticism, and fanaticism is closely related to extremism. So it's not clear why one should be interested in fanaticism and not extremism. In any case, extremism is an important subject in the world today. And I think it would be good if, as philosophers, we had something to say about it. So what I'm going to do in today's talk is to, first of all, outline three mainstream views or analyses of extremism. And then having done that and explored the strengths and weaknesses of these analyses, I'm then going to develop my own analysis of extremism, which is what I call a mindset analysis of extremism. So I want to make the case for thinking of extremism in mindset terms, and then I'll look at the relationship between extremism and fanaticism, and also about the assumption that both extremism and fanaticism are vices of some sort. All right, so I'm going to now share my screen and go through the slides that I have prepared. So I said that I was going to start by distinguishing between three varieties of extremism, or to put it another way, three types of extremist. First of all, there's what I call methods extremism. So methods extremists are individuals or groups or organizations that use or endorse the use of extreme methods in pursuit of their objectives. Now, obviously, there's a question here about how we understand the notion of an extreme method. This is usually understood as involving violence, and I'll talk about extremism and violence in a little while. However, the basic idea of methods extremism is that extremism is not about what you believe, it's not about what your objectives are, it's about how you defend and promote those objectives. And the methods extremist is fundamentally someone who uses extreme methods in support of their position. A second understanding of extremism is a positional understanding. So on this understanding, extremism is fundamentally a question of one's ideological beliefs. So ideologies you can think of as positions in ideological space. So you can think of ideologies as arrayed in ideological space, for example, running from left to right. And positional extremists are simply individuals or groups or organizations that subscribe to an extremist ideology. That is to say, an ideology that is at one or other end of the ideological spectrum. Now, this, of course, raises a whole lot of questions about the nature of ideological space. So, for example, you might wonder how many dimensions ideological space are and what determines the location of a given ideology in ideological space. So that's going to be a question for the positional view. Now, one thing that the positional approach seems to be missing is any idea that being an extremist is not, or not just, a matter of what you believe, what your ideological stance is. It's also a matter of how you believe, your mode of belief. So there is the idea that extremists, in this psychological sense, are people whose beliefs or political commitments take a particular form. So extremism in this sense is a characteristic of the way beliefs are held rather than their location along some dimension. So there are the three basic views of extremism, analyses of extremism. So let's just consider the first of those analyses, methods extremism. So extremists are people who use extreme methods or endorse the use of extreme methods. So the first question is, well, what's an extreme method? It's natural, I think, to think of extreme methods as involving violence. People who are methods extremists are people who turn to violence in support of their political agendas. Just a couple of quick observations about that. The first observation is that extreme methods actually don't need to be violent. If you think back to the IRA hunger strikes 30 or 40 years ago, a whole bunch of IRA fighters went on hunger strike. One of them, Bobby Sands, didn't take food for 66 days and eventually died. Well, that looks like an extreme method of making a political point, but it didn't involve violence. On the other side of the coin, it's not clear to me anyway that the use of violence in pursuit of political objectives necessarily makes one a methods extremist. So one can think here of the armed struggle of the ANC in South Africa during the apartheid era. So certainly the ANC used violence against apartheid. And one argument for saying that the use of violence by the ANC didn't constitute the use of an extreme method was the idea that they had no alternative. And this was certainly Mandela's view, that of course non-violence was preferable, but non-violence wasn't an option for the ANC, and therefore the turn to political violence meant doing the only thing they could do. And of course, it was violence in pursuit of a just cause, namely the ending of apartheid. I think we can see here kind of two perspectives on violence in politics. So the intrinsicalist perspective says that the extent to which a person or organization counts as an extremist in the methods sense depends on the intrinsic qualities of their methods. So this is the view of someone who says that, regardless of the context, regardless of the circumstances, the use of violence amounts to the use of an extreme method. So on this view, anyone who uses violence is a methods extremist. So this is the idea that it's just the nature of the method itself, not the context, that counts. The alternative view says that the question whether the use of a particular method constitutes methods extremism depends on a range of contextual factors. So there's a whole mass of questions, I think, which bear on the question whether using violence amounts to a form of extremism. So first of all, there are questions about the nature of the ends or objectives of violence. What was the violence being used for? Was it being used, as it were, in the name of justice or not? So violence to end apartheid looks like a case of violence with a worthy objective, and the contextualist says that has at least a bearing on whether we should regard the use of violence in that situation as amounting to a form of extremism. Of course, there are questions about the nature of the violence itself. This is a sort of concession to intrinsicalism that violence can be more or less extreme, the methods extremist is someone who resorts to extreme violence, as for example ISIS does. Third consideration that's relevant here is the necessity of violence. So here are two quotations. Nelson Mandela: "Violence was the only method that would destroy apartheid," and Fanon, who argued that colonialism is violence in a natural state and it will only yield when confronted with greater violence. So the thought is that you're open to accusations of extremism when you use violence in pursuit of political ends where there is an alternative, where there's a non-violent alternative. Necessary violence, in the sense described by Mandela, would not count as a form of methods extremism. There are also questions about the proportionality of violence. So the thought is that methods extremists are not just people who use violence and use it unnecessarily, often for unworthy causes, but the violence they use is disproportionate. So the proportionality of violence is another interesting and relevant consideration here. Lastly, there are questions about the targets of violence. So the thought is that extremists use violence against innocents or non-competents, and indeed some extremists don't even recognize the distinction between innocents and legitimate targets. So there are some statements by Osama bin Laden in which he basically claims that all Americans are legitimate targets, and so there's no such thing as an innocent American on that interpretation. Elsewhere, bin Laden accepts that there is the category of an innocent victim of terrorism, but he argues that, as he puts it, the killing of innocents is valid both religiously and logically. Now, that bizarre statement seems to me to sum up one important aspect of the extremists' perspective on violence. All right, so moving on now to the ideological view of extremism. So this is what I call the positional conception. So the positional conception says that an ideology counts as positionally extremist in virtue of its location in ideological space. So it's the content of your ideological beliefs that determine whether you're an extremist or not. Now, ideological space is in turn multidimensional. So classically, when people talk about positional extremism, they talk about ideological space as having a left-right dimension. And that is indeed one dimension of ideological space. But of course, it's not the only dimension. And there are many intuitively extremist ideologies that don't have an obvious location on the left-right spectrum. So the ideology of ISIS is a good example of that. Is it left-wing? Is it right-wing? Well, it's hard to say, but it's certainly extremist. So that suggests that we need to think of ideological space as having more than one dimension. Another classic case that gets discussed in these contexts is fascism, which looks like an extremist ideology. But the question whether fascism is an extremist ideology of the right is highly controversial, as you'll know if you've read any of the literature on fascism. Certainly, fascists themselves, fascist theorists themselves, talk about fascism as a third way between left and right, and so they would certainly deny that fascism is on the extreme right of the left-right spectrum. So what other spectra are there of ideological space? Well, there's a whole bunch. It's not just the case that there's a single other dimension, but one other dimension that's certainly relevant is what you might call the pro-violence spectrum. So you can also distinguish ideologies in terms of their attitude to violence. So one thing you can say both about fascism and about certain forms of Islamism is that they are pro-violence to a very considerable degree, and this would make them extremist on the pro-violence scale. I should add that this way of thinking about extremism has one rather kind of strange consequence, which is that pacifists will also count as extremists on this view, because they are at the opposite end of the pro-violence spectrum. They're at the anti-violence end of the pro-violence spectrum, and some may have some hesitation about classifying pacifists as extremists. So that's the idea that ideological space is multidimensional, and that an ideology is extremist on this view as long as it is on the extreme end of at least one dimension of ideological space. Now, of course, there's the further question: how do you determine an ideology's location in ideological space? How do you decide where on the left-right spectrum a particular ideology like fascism should be placed? One way to think about this is in terms of a series of diagnostic questions that are used to locate an ideology. So classically, there are questions about the role of the state, questions about human rights, questions about violence, and so on and so forth. So these are all questions that can be asked of a given ideology, and its location in ideological space will then be determined by its answers to these particular questions. Now, this account of positional extremism that I've just been setting out introduces at least two forms of relativity. Now, this is not an objection to the positional conception of extremism, it's just an observation that this view introduces two types of relativity. So on the one hand, the location of an ideology in ideological space is, as you might say, dimension relative. So there's always relativity to a dimension, given that ideological space is multi-dimensional. So an ideology that is in the middle of one dimension, so for example, the left-right dimension might be at the far end of a different dimension. So that's one kind of fairly straightforward relativity on the positional conception. A second form of relativity is what I call menu relativity. So even if you just focus on a single dimension, like the left-right dimension, the location of an ideology along that dimension is going to depend on the nature of the questions that are used to determine its location. So I mentioned earlier a set of questions that classically been used to determine an ideology's location on the left-right spectrum, so questions about its view of the state and so on. But of course, what counts as left and right also varies historically and culturally. Today, certainly in an American context, there are questions about abortion, for example, that are regarded as relevant, highly relevant to an ideology's location on the left-right spectrum that wouldn't traditionally have been regarded as nearly as important. So there are these two forms of relativity that arise with regard to positional extremism. Now, so far I've introduced two types of extremism, positional and methods extremism, and it's worth noting that these are not unconnected. There is, of course, a link between your ideology and your view of violence, because many ideologies actually have a view of violence. You might say that some, though not all, positionally extremist ideologies encourage the use of extreme methods. So in that case, the use of extreme methods is explained, at least in part, by the user's ideology, whereas other ideologies prohibit the use of extreme methods to advance political objectives. And it can happen that political actors whose ideologies are not extremist in positional terms might still use or support the use of extreme methods to advance their ideological interests. So an interesting case study here is the neoliberal defense of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Neoliberals are certainly on the right, perhaps not extremists, but they certainly supported the use of violence to advance the neoliberal agenda in Iraq. So that's an example of an ideology that is not itself perhaps at the extreme end of the left-right spectrum, nevertheless endorsing the use of extreme methods. Now, one thing that seems to be missing from the positional conception of extremism is the following. What this conception focuses on is entirely the content of one's ideology. It's entirely concerned with what you believe. And a kind of concern that you might have about that is to say, well, look, whether you're an extremist or not isn't just a matter of what your beliefs are, what your ideology is. It's also a matter of, as it were, how you believe what you believe. It's also a matter of your way of believing. So here's a clear statement of that approach. In this sense, the psychological sense, extremism is a characteristic of the way beliefs are held, rather than their location along some dimension. For example, if they're held rigidly or the person holding them displays a small capacity or willingness to compromise. So, of course, some people sometimes say that extremists are people who hold their beliefs in a particularly fervent way, and that is sometimes understood phenomenologically, the idea being that there's a phenomenology of belief, and that extremists believe particularly fervently. But you don't need to think of psychological extremism in that way. You can also think of it in a more dispositional way. Extremists in the psychological sense have certain dispositions, the disposition to hold on to their beliefs come what may, the disposition to reject compromise. So this is what you might think of as a way of believing conception of extremism. Now, there are some questions about this conception, which I now want to go into. I mean, the first concern about thinking of extremism in terms of ways of believing is that it fails to distinguish an extremist from a person of principle. So this is an observation that Nozick makes in a good discussion of extremism, where he says, after all, there are some correct principles to which one wants to adhere and not surrender. So if you think about the principle of one person, one vote, for example, I might not be willing to compromise on that principle. I might not be willing to surrender that principle, but that doesn't make me an extremist, surely. One issue here is, well, how do you distinguish between someone whose unwillingness to compromise makes them principled versus someone whose unwillingness to compromise makes them extremists in the psychological sense? So one thing you might say in answer to that question is that extremists are not just people who are unwilling to compromise, but they're uncompromising about the wrong things. Now that might be right, but it takes us back to thinking of extremism in terms of what you believe as well as how you believe. So the suggestion is that if you really want to distinguish between being an extremist and being a person of principle, in relation to the issue of compromise, then the only way you can really draw that distinction is to take some account of the content of a person's beliefs. Extremism now is once again, at least partly, a matter of what one believes as well as how one believes. So extremists are people who have a fervent, uncompromising, dogmatic commitment to beliefs that ought not to be held in that way, or ought not to be held at all. So extremism then is about the substance of a person's beliefs as well as a matter of the form of their beliefs or their way of believing. Just one further observation about extremism in the psychological sense. Extremism isn't just about one's beliefs. There are many other psychological dimensions of extremism that need to be taken into account. And this brings me to the approach that I want to defend and promote. And this is the idea that extremism at the level of individuals or individual psychology is a question of the individual's mindset. So here's the claim. Extremism in the psychological sense consists in possession of an extremist mindset. And it's the extremist mindset that accounts for a person's positional extremism as well as for their methods extremism. Now, the key to this conception is, of course, the notion of a mindset. So let me just start with some general remarks about how I understand a mindset. Now, this isn't intended as an exhaustive account by any means, but it's an account of the main components of a mindset. So the first thought is that a person's mindset is at least partly a function of their preoccupations. Preoccupations are the things that attract one's attention. Preoccupations in the most extreme form are what one thinks of as obsessions. So your mindset is at least partly a function of your preoccupations. It's also a function of your attitudes. It's a function of your emotions, and it's a function of your ways of thinking, a function of how you think. So I'll come back in a while and say more about these things, but just to say now that this is the thesis. The extremist mindset is constituted by distinctive preoccupations, attitudes, emotions, and ways of thinking. So being an extremist is a matter of having an extremist mindset. Having an extremist mindset is a matter of having certain characteristic preoccupations, attitudes, emotions, and ways of thinking. And one of the consequences of this view is, of course, that extremists at opposite ends of ideological space can have the same mindset. Now, this is, of course, an idea that it is familiar. It really goes back to Eric Hoffer's book, The True Believer. Now, Hoffer talks about fanatics rather than extremists, and this is what Hoffer says, famous observation. Though they seem to be at opposite poles, fanatics of all kinds are actually crowded together at one end. It is the fanatic and the moderate who are poles apart and never meet. So what Hoffer says about fanaticism, I think, is also true of extremism. So extremists at opposite poles of a given dimension of ideological space can actually have a common mindset. And that is very much in keeping with Hoffer's insight. All right, so let me now just try and spell out what I take these the extremist mindset to consist in. So I talked about extremist preoccupation. So what are extremists preoccupied with? What is it that they really care about? And I want to suggest that one common preoccupation of extremists is purity. So this is the purity preoccupation, which I take to be distinctive of extremism. So extremists are preoccupied with the actual or threatened dilution of the religious, ethnic, or ideological purity of their in-group by powerful external forces. So certainly, if you look at the history of extremism, there are many examples of this purity preoccupation. So here are three examples. If you look at ISIS, there's a preoccupation there with purifying the Islamic lands of all alien and infidel influences. Going back further, of course, you have the Nazis' racial purity laws, again, a version of the purity preoccupation. And also in the 1970s, you had the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia with their preoccupation with ideological purity. Now, it's an interesting question, I think, where this preoccupation with purity comes from. And my view is that it's very closely tied to something else that extremists are preoccupied with, or at least many extremists are preoccupied with, which is their own virtue. Extremists regard themselves as virtuous, and this is a very important element of the extremist mindset. and their virtue consists in their purity, religious, ethnic, or ideological. And this really goes back to the French Revolution and to Robespierre, who famously described the Great Terror as an emanation of virtue. And there was someone for whom virtue and incorruptibility were very closely tied to a preoccupation with purity. And I take the purity preoccupation to be a distinctively extremist preoccupation. Okay, so now moving on, here are two other extremist preoccupations. There's a preoccupation with victimhood and a preoccupation with humiliation. Extremists very often regard themselves as victims of persecution. So Jason Stanley, in his book on fascism, refers to this as victimology. And I think it's absolutely right that victimology plays a major role, not just in fascism, but in extremist movements generally. Now, this preoccupation with persecution then leads to a preoccupation with humiliation and the need to fight back. And I think the theme of humiliation is extremely important for an understanding of extremism. And a particularly potent form of this preoccupation is a preoccupation with what Martha Nussbaum calls humiliated masculinity. She talks about the role of humiliated masculinity in Hindu extremism. And there's also work recently by Julia Ebner on a preoccupation with humiliation among so-called incels, involuntarily celibate males, typically. Now, what's striking in all of these cases that I've just discussed is that these concerns with preoccupation, these concerns with humiliation and victimhood, have no foundation in reality. The persecution that extremists are preoccupied with is typically imaginary persecution, or alternatively, even if it's real persecution, they greatly exaggerate its extent. So these are further extremist preoccupations, and again, they are very apparent in many historical examples of extremists and extremism. So far then I've talked about three extremist, or perhaps four extremist preoccupations: purity, virtue, victimhood, and humiliation. Now turning to the issue of extremist attitudes, when I talk about the extremist mindset, I'm also talking about a distinctive set of attitudes. So what are these attitudes that I'm talking about? So here are, I think, some of the key extremist attitudes. So first of all, there's pro-violence. So certainly in the case of militant extremism, there's a positive attitude to violence as a means of attaining one's political objectives. So that's a classically extremist attitude, pro-violence. Secondly, there's hostility to compromise. So this goes back to the initial observation I made about ways of believing. So the thought is that extremists believe uncompromisingly, and you can think of that as embodying a hostile attitude to compromise. I'll come back in a minute to the issue of distinguishing between extremism and being principled. A third extremist attitude is indifference to the negative consequences of their actions or policies. So extremists may show some awareness of the negative consequences of their policies, but their view is typically that you can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. They just don't care about the negative consequences of their policies, which they think of as a price worth paying for achieving their overall objectives. Another extremist attitude is intolerance of the other, intolerance of the religious, ideological, or racial other. And lastly, there is anti-pluralism, that is rejection of the idea that there is no uniquely right way of living. So extremists typically think that there is a uniquely right way of living, and they also regard it as legitimate to insist, to impose their vision of life on others. So these are some examples of what I take to be core extremist attitudes. Now, what about this issue that I mentioned earlier on about how you distinguish between being uncompromising and being principled? Now, this is a difficult and important question, and I think an answer to it is suggested by Avishai Margalit in his book on compromise. And this is what Margalit says, and I think this is along the right lines. On his view, political compromises, especially compromises for the sake of peace, are a good thing. Only what he calls rotten compromises are to be avoided at all costs. So compromise is okay, compromise is good, but not rotten compromises. And a rotten compromise, in Margalit's sense, is an agreement to establish or maintain an inhuman regime. So here's a kind of simple take on the issue of extremism versus being principled. Being principled does not require hostility to compromise per se. A principled person is not hostile to compromise per se. What the principled person rejects is rotten compromises, compromises that establish or maintain an inhuman regime. Whereas extremism is the disposition to view any compromise as a rotten compromise. Extremists typically think that all compromises are forms of capitulation or acts of pollution. And that's the fundamental difference between a person of principle and a person who is an extremist. So if you think about the ANC struggle against apartheid, of course there were matters about which Mandela was uncompromising, but what he rejected was rotten compromises, compromises that would, for example, enable the continuation of apartheid, a system of cruelty and injustice. So when you talk about the extremist mindset, then you are really talking about something that goes beyond a person of principle. The core of the extremist mindset, I think, is the disposition to view any and all compromises as rotten. Moving on to the emotional dimension of the extremist mindset, extremists are characteristically motivated by certain violent passions in Hume's sense, or emotions, and these passions and emotions are linked to their preoccupations. So, for example, anger, resentment, humiliation, and self-pity. Now, of course, these are not just emotions that extremists experience. However, in the case of extremists, these emotions are particularly impervious to reason. With extremists, even more than the rest of us, they are irrational emotions in Bernard Williams's sense. An emotion is irrational when considerations which show it to be inappropriate fail to display it. And the last element of the extremist mindset that I will go into here is the extremist ways of thinking. I don't really want to say very much about this other than to say that these are some of the extremist thinking styles that are very common. Extremists are prone to apocalyptic thinking. They're certainly prone to conspiracy thinking. And they're prone to Manichaean thinking, the disposition to view reality in terms of light and dark, good and evil. You're either for us or you're against us. So that's the extremist mindset. Those are the core elements of the extremist mindset. And it follows from this account that that extremism in the mindset sense is a matter of degree. A person's mindset can be more or less extremist. Extremists needn't display all the features of the extremist mindset, but certain core features must be displayed. So pro-violence looks like an essential feature of at least the militant extremist mindset, but not an essential feature, I think, of extremism per se. You can be an extremist without being pro-violence. All right, so let me just sum up where we've got to so far. I started off by distinguishing between three approaches to extremism: the positional approach, the methods approach, and the psychological approach. I looked at some of the issues that arise with respect to all of these approaches, and I then developed my own view, which is the mindset view. The mindset view is, broadly speaking, psychological, but it does take account of the content of a person's beliefs. A mindset extremist is someone who has certain characteristic preoccupations, attitudes, emotions, and ways of thinking. But you can't understand what these characteristic attitudes and preoccupations are without taking some account of the content of their beliefs. And that comes out particularly clearly with respect to the issue of compromise. Extremists regard all compromises as rotten compromises, whereas people of principle don't take that view. So in drawing that distinction, you need to take some account of what it is that the extremist objects to in particular. Now, extremism, as I've just described it, seems to be increasingly prevalent in mainstream politics. And I want to give you an illustration of how these various aspects of the extremist mindset play out in mainstream politics. And the example I want to suggest is what I call Brextremism. So I'm talking here about the mindset of the extreme pro-Brexit wing of British politics. So here are some observations. So first of all, on the issue of compromise, one of the characteristics of Brextremists is that they regard any compromise over Brexit as a capitulation. So that's one important respect in which Brextremists are extremists. Secondly, they are preoccupied with a form of purity. So they talk at length about the importance of a pure Brexit or a clean Brexit. So there you see the purity preoccupation of extremists. And of course, there's also victimology. So in a way, one of the most important aspects of the Brextremist mindset is a preoccupation with persecution, alleged persecution by the EU. So there you have another element of the extremist mindset that is apparent in this case. I talked earlier on about indifference to negative consequences. Well, you certainly see that in the Brextremist mindset. So arguments to the effect that Brexit will be economically damaging for the UK carry very little weight with Brextremists. Some of them even embrace these negative consequences as evidence of their ideological purity. So certainly there you have another element of the extremist mindset, and thinking about the emotional component. Two fundamental emotions that drive the Brexit cause are resentment of the EU, and a certain kind of national self-pity. So I think that the mindset model that I've been elaborating here helps to make sense of the Brextremist phenomenon. It helps to make sense of the idea that at least some elements of the pro-Brexit constituency in the UK are indeed extremists. However, they're not pro-violence, or at least most of them are not pro-violence. And I think this is also very much in keeping with my suggestion that you can be an extremist without being violent or even being pro-violence. All right, so the next thing is fanaticism. I've said what I think extremism is. I now want to say what fanaticism is. Now, there's a lot to be said about fanaticism, and I'm just going to state somewhat dogmatically what I think fanatics are. So here are 3 bullet points that sum up my view. So fanatics are willing to trample on other people's ideals and interests in pursuit of their own perverted ideals. Secondly, extremists are incapable or unwilling to think critically about their own ideals, which they regard as indubitable. And thirdly, fanatics are willing to sacrifice themselves and others in pursuit of their ideals. So let me just go through those again a bit more slowly. So the thought is that fanatics have their own ideals, which they recognize as being at odds with other people's ideals. They have their own interests, which they recognize as being in conflict with other people's interests. One feature of fanatics is their willingness, their preparedness to simply trample on other people's interests and ideals in pursuit of their own. Now, I stipulated in my account that the fanatics' own ideals are perverted ideals. That's controversial. I mean, you might think that it's enough that you're enough to make you an extremist, that you're willing to trample on other people's ideals and interests, regardless of whether your own ideals and interests are perverted. So that's an issue that will undoubtedly come up in further discussion. Less controversial, I think, is the second feature. Fanatics are incapable or unwilling to think critically about their own ideals. So fanatics are distinguished by the absence of doubt, excessive certainty, overconfidence about their own ideals. And the third element of fanaticism, which I think is very important, is the element of self-sacrifice. So fanatics are typically willing to sacrifice themselves and others, such as members of their own families, in pursuit of their own ideals. So that's fanaticism, as I understand it. So what's the relationship then between extremism and fanaticism? So I want to suggest that they're not the same. So first of all, start off with the positional extremist, someone who has views that place them at one or other end of an ideological spectrum. But of course, it's possible to be an armchair positional extremist. So the armchair positional extremist has extreme views, but doesn't seek to impose them on others. So this is extremism without fanaticism. Also, fanatics needn't be preoccupied with purity and victimhood and so on. So fanatics needn't be extremists. And I just want to emphasize here this point, that extremism is really distinguished by certain characteristic preoccupations. And I think the purity preoccupation is particularly fundamental. Whereas I don't think that to be a fanatic, you need to be particularly preoccupied with purity. You don't need to be preoccupied with victimhood. I think as a matter of fact, many fanatics do have these preoccupations, but they aren't necessary to fanaticism. So I think the lesson I would draw from this is that there's certainly a conceptual distinction between extremism and fanaticism, though not surprisingly, they often go hand in hand in practice. So moving on, let me now say something about in a way, a rather kind of fundamental issue. Of course, it's generally assumed that extremism and fanaticism are vicious, deplorable, bad in some sense. And yet, there have been attempts to defend and justify both extremism and fanaticism. And here are three quotations that illustrate the point. So the first is the point that we owe our political liberties today, or many of them, to some extremists of the past. So just as a matter of historical fact, fanaticism or extremism can actually contribute to freedom and justice. This is Joel Olson, who says that sometimes fanatical tactics are necessary to let in the light of reason, and Olson particularly gives the example of 19th century abolitionists in the US. So radical abolitionists were committed to the immediate emancipation of the slaves in the US without compensation for slave owners. Now, the abolitionists were described as, and described themselves as, fanatics. They were self-defined fanatics with an unyielding commitment to the immediate and unconditional emancipation of the enslaved. So that looks like an example of what you might call good fanaticism, fanaticism in a good cause. So perhaps one way to put it would be to say that actually, just as a matter of historical fact, extremists and fanatics have sometimes been extremists and fanatics on the side of democracy. There have been extremists and fanatics on the side of justice, on the side of freedom. So that suggests that extremism per se isn't a bad thing. Fanaticism per se isn't a bad thing. It depends on one's objectives. However, I don't find this argument particularly compelling. So first of all, just looking at Olson's example of the 19th century abolitionist movement in the US, on my view, it isn't right to describe them as extremists. They weren't extremists because they lacked many of the characteristic preoccupations of extremists. They weren't, for example, preoccupied with purity. They were preoccupied with the victimization of slaves, but these weren't fantasies of persecution and victimization. The slaves really were persecuted. They really were victimized. The radical abolitionists were certainly uncompromising, but the compromises they had rejected were rotten compromises, compromises to maintain an inhuman regime, namely slavery. So there are a number of respects in which I think the 19th century abolitionists were not extremists. Were they fanatics? Well, they were willing to trample on the interests of slave owners, but I don't think that made them fanatics in and of itself. Mainly because the interests of slave owners didn't merit not being trampled on. And I think it's relevant also that the abolitionists' own ideals were not perverted ideals. The abolitionists were certainly implacable, but what they were implacably opposed to was a cruel and inhuman practice, namely slavery. So I don't myself find it compelling to think of this example of 19th century abolitionism as a good example of the upside of fanaticism or the upside of extremism. I think a much better way to think about the abolitionist movement is to think of them as radicals. Radicalism can certainly be a force for the good, but I think it's just a confusion to take that as evidence of the virtues of extremism and fanaticism. Here's a summary of that point. So here's a definition of radicalism. Radicalism is contention that is outside the common routines of politics present within a society. It's oriented towards substantial change in social, cultural, economic, and/or political structures, and is undertaken using extra institutional means. But none of that necessarily amounts to fanaticism, or indeed to extremism. So let me sum up where we have got to. So my approach then to both extremism and fanaticism is an approach that focuses very much on the what you might think of as the psychological dimension of both, but I want to understand the psychology in terms of this idea of a mindset, and I think this is a kind of research agenda to think about the extremist mindset and what it consists of. Now, just to end with, I just want to make a kind of methodological observation. Somebody might listen to what I've said and say, well, yeah, but how do you figure out what is and what isn't part of the extremist mindset? Now, you certainly can't do it just by armchair philosophy. Working out the extremist mindset actually does involve taking account of what actual extremists have been preoccupied with, for example. So there needs to be a kind of empirical component in a philosophical analysis of the extremist mindset. But I don't myself find that troubling. I'm quite happy with the idea that progress in philosophy requires both philosophical reflection, armchair reflection, and empirical input. And indeed, it seems to me that extremism is a classic example of a topic where both sorts of methodology are required. As I said, there isn't very much in philosophy about extremism, but I hope to have convinced you that extremism is an interesting and worthwhile topic. Okay, well, thank you for listening.